Welcome to the Altogether Show with Eric Satz. On this show, you'll hear Eric's unfiltered interviews with interesting and untraditional entrepreneurs who ignored boundaries and followed their instincts and own paths, and now empower others to do the same. Subscribe to the show and learn more by visiting altogether.show. And now your host, Eric Satz.
The guest on the show this week is Andy Weissman, co-managing partner of Union Square Ventures. And if you've hung around the VC community rim even just a little bit, you know that USV actually needs no introduction. Andy is kind, thoughtful, considerate. He's made a profession of the startup world, both as an investor and operator. But if you really want to see his eyes light up, start talking about music or food. I hope you enjoy the show.
This episode of the Altogether Show is brought to you by Alto IRA. Alto is a digital, self-directed IRA company modernizing IRA investing. They make it easy and cost-effective for individual investors to access their retirement savings and invest in alternative assets. To learn more, visit altoira.com.
Andy Weissman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eric.
I am just like over the moon to have you as a guest on the show. I think you know that. And typically the way I would start off a show is with an introduction where I would say, Andy went to Wesleyan undergrad, a second-rate school, if ever an Amherst grad could identify one, and then got his JD from Georgetown, and then entered the world of venture capital, maybe, 10 years later, and then founded BetaWorks, and now finds himself at USV, back in venture capital, or in venture capital in a different way. But actually what I'd like to do is ask you, who is Andy Weissman?
Wow, thank you for what a wonderful introduction and an incredibly difficult conversation. I think Andy Weissman is someone who continually stumbles through life looking for peace and happiness and comfort, but it's always one step away. It's a little elusive.
It's just out of reach.
Just out of reach. Like close enough sometimes that you can see it, but never quite get it.
Yeah. So I love that response, by the way. So I'm going to try and ground us a little bit, make it a little more tangible. So when and where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, where I am right now, in sometime in the 1960s.
Yeah. Good answer.
Closer to 1970 than 1960.
Fair enough.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in Flatbush, in the Flatbush area where my parents lived.
Do you have any siblings?
Yeah, I have two brothers, two younger brothers and a younger sister. I'm the oldest of the four.
And what's the year span between youngest to you oldest?
Yeah, another good question. It's about 17 years. It's a big span. So
That's significant.
So we go like 3.5, kind of 13.5, 17. So there's a big jump in the middle.
Wow. So kind of begs the question, what did your parents do to support the family?
Well, my mom was a school teacher, on and off, and then a homemaker. And my dad was, interestingly, he's what we right now would call an entrepreneur, but back then I don't think that was a word that was actually used in common parlance the way we would use it about you and your ventures, for example, or any number of entrepreneurs, right? And so so when you don't have that word to describe it, he was someone that kind of bounced around from venture to venture. He built shopping malls. He practiced law. He built shopping malls. He had and then he had a printing company. He printed security documents. So he printed stock certificates while there were those, and then things like stamps and foreign currencies and any type of document that needed to be printed that had security associated with that printing, because you were printing scarce assets, or they were representing money or something of monetary value. But he bounced around between those things wherever he thought he saw there was a good opportunity to do something.
Did that mindset rub off on you? Was that sort of imprinted in some way?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, like, I guess at some level, all of our experiences in life are imprinted upon us in some way, but I don't know if I think I only afterwards, probably in the last 10 years, when the word entrepreneur had a meaning outside of its definition in the dictionary, did I probably say, hey, that was kind of what my dad did in a way. And at the same time, I realized that my grandfather growing up, he called himself an inventor. He came over from Turkey. He was born in Jerusalem, and he called himself an inventor. When I asked him what he did, he called himself an inventor. He invented things. His idol was Thomas Edison, and he just kind of kept inventing things and patenting them. And then he created this lock. He actually invented the exit door that you push where the alarm goes off. My
Yes,
grandfather my grandfather invented that, and he invented it
that is
because
cool.
yeah, it is pretty cool, right? Because he walked by this. He was lived in New York City his whole life, in Brooklyn, and the East Village, and around Union Square. And he used to walk to his office by a supermarket, and the fire codes were such that you could not have the exit door that locked for in case of fire. And so he would see people shoplifting through that back door every day. So he invented this door that locked, but you could get out, and the alarm would go off. That was his thing. And then he manufactured a bunch of them, and he patented it, and they ended up selling the patent to a company that actually manufactured them, and which enabled him to live a very comfortable middle class life the rest of his life. But so he called himself an inventor, and in the last 10 years or so, again going back to like the use of language to describe things, I thought of like. If in this era, my grandfather would be an entrepreneur, right? You wouldn't
No
patent something
question.
and sell it. Why would you do that? You'd create a company around it. But he had no tools, no access to capital, no access to wait, how do you build a company? Who do you hire? None of that. And so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He found a company that wanted to buy the damn patent and commercialize it. And so that like so maybe like those are the experiences that drive us. I mentioned my grandfather because the other interesting thing he used to do is he used to write his letters a lot. We lived in the same city. We saw him once a week my whole life. Um, and he used to still write. He'd show up and hand you a letter. He'd type a letter out. That was his style, and they were long letters about anything, but any number of topics. But I remember when I was young, there were a series of letters about computers. This was the early '70s. That
Okay.
computers were the future. You know, and think about when you're like 8, 10, 12, 14. You're like, yeah, sure, whatever, Grandpa.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Brooklyn Dodgers. Right? But those letters kept coming, and I've got copies of them and stuff. And he would explain like binary technologies, and he would really like try and like explain why they were so fundamental. Sometimes I think like, was it by chance that I ended up in the industry that I'm in? Or was there something tying all those things back together? I never thought about that. And in fact, just mostly in my career, I just kind of stumbled around, right? Like, oh, this seems interesting. Like you, Eric, right? This seems interesting. I'll do this. This seems interesting. I'll do this. This isn't interesting. I'll quit this, right? Um, so maybe that was like in there, right? Somehow.
I do think there's nature nurture
Yeah.
to it. Um, and so this also kind of begs the question, what part did your mom play in this, right? I mean, she was a teacher, and I'll let the audience know you're a Virgo,
Yes.
which is not exactly um, the the horoscope that is looking for risk and
No,
challenge. So
not at
so
all.
so what role did your mom play?
We grew up on 87th Street in New York, and building's entrance was on 87th Street, and our
East or West Side?
east side,
Okay.
East 87th Street, and our apartment faced 86th Street. And on 86th Street there's this crosstown bus that goes from 86th Street all the way from the East River all the way to the Hudson River. And we always went to school on the west side our whole lives. And at a very early, so the role my mom played, I think, was twofold. And I believe in hindsight, an uncomfortably young age, she put us on the public bus to go to school. Because I think my brother was like 8 and I was like 11, and he was the younger brother, so he could tag along. And only in hindsight, like I remember we'd say to her, like, he was 8 years old. Like, what were you doing? Um, and so, and then because the apartment faced 86th Street, she could actually, from her bedroom window, could see the bus stop. Um, and sometimes in the afternoons would sit waiting for us to come home. And then she saw us, and we'd come home and we'd have, like, our glass of milk or juice or the afternoon snack or whatever. In a way that was, in a way that I would like. That's like, I have this incredibly strong memory of that. There's something about that, right? Like the centrality, like that, even when you're a young kid and on the school bus alone going to the west side of town, there's someone kind of watching over you, you know, and the importance of that.
That's really cool. And
Yeah.
and that was at a time where you could still lick like the metal pole
Oh,
in the
totally.
middle of the bus and
Yeah.
and not get sick.
Yeah,
Right?
totally. 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 Yeah. And we have a funny story. My brother did this too. One day, this is a very famous story in my small little family. My brother we lived on Second Avenue, and there was the bus stop right on Second Avenue, and he got off on Third Avenue, and he walked from Third Avenue to Second Avenue down the center of 86th Street is a two-way street, right? So there's
Yep.
buses that go east and west, and he walked down the yellow lines down the center. And my mom caught him because she was watching that day. And why did he do it? Because you're 10 years old, it's what you do,
Right.
And she
Because I
caught him
could.
because he could, right? Like, he's like, I'm just going to walk down and let the cars go back and forth and see what happens. And she busted them, So
That
yeah, no consequence. There's no consequence, right? We didn't have any rules or consequences, but he was seen, you know.
you're now a parent
Yeah,
and
like you,
like me,
like you.
you're a parent of 2 kids, also like me. Have you consciously taken something from that model from your childhood to your parenthood?
Did you? You're a Bruce Springsteen fan, right?
I like Bruce
Okay,
Springsteen. I am not, however, a music guy the way you are.
okay, okay. Did you watch the Bruce Springsteen on Broadway
I
show on
did.
Netflix? Okay,
I did.
there. I went to opening night luck. Yeah, I had a friend, and we both entered the lottery, and our deal was if someone wins, you have to take the other person. And my friend won, so I went to opening night, which was incredible because I think it's a great show, but also didn't know what to expect. It's like if you saw Hamilton early before you knew what to expect. And so
Right.
there's this part in there where he talks about his relationship with his father, and which was, like all relationships, complex. And his father, to him, part of that complexity was that his father was always like a ghost to him, and a ghost haunts you as you go forward. And it made him realize, as a parent, that there are really two modes you can play for your kids. You can be a ghost and haunt them, and you're always there lingering, or you can be an ancestor to them, which is a very strong memory, behind them,
Hmm.
but not haunting them along the way. And I thought that was a really unbelievably interesting construct, which makes a lot of sense. You want to be ancestors to them. You want to push them in front of you and be behind them, but they're in front, and not be sitting next to them as the ghost, where they're kind of looking up at you, worried or scared or afraid.
Is the line between the two blurry?
Totally, it can be very blurry. In fact, you have to be, I think, and this is part of his message, is you have to be pretty conscious and conspicuous about where you are on the line, or where you might be perceived by your children on the line.
So your kids are 20, 20, 21?
21.
Is that right?
Yep.
21 and 18?
Yep.
How old?
17.
21 and
17. 17.
17.
Yep.
So, has that line shifted?
So my takeaway from that little life lesson was the line always shifts, and you need to be aware of, if you're not conscious of it, you'll be a ghost. You could be perceived as being a ghost, and you have to be conscious of not being that. and being like, push them forward,
I could not agree more with that analogy and assessment. And, sort of at least for me, a more recent example was watching, you still have one who's going to do it, but watching my kids go through the college admissions process.
Yeah, totally.
And knowing what you can and cannot say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very hard lesson.
Yeah, really hard, really hard. And you want to, and I think that like, I don't know, I think as human beings, like we have the best of intentions, right? We
Always.
want always, but I think that like in a way as a parent, our jobs are to kind of our job never changes. It's kind of like allow them to walk on their own, and whether that's like holding their hands or see ya.
It's funny you say that because I'm 50 years old now, and when I talk to my father, I'm still his kid.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm still his son. I'm 50 years old. I have a son of my own.
Totally.
But and so I look at my kids who are now 21 and 19 and who are interested in what I have to say to a point, and I'm like, but you're still my kid.
Yeah. Yeah. And they always will be, which is kind of wonderful. Right. But at the same time, you want to like move into that ancestor mode, where you're behind them, probably not beside them anymore.
That's right. So let me segue here a little bit from maybe personal and family to professional. And the segue for me is, how has having a family affected your professional choices in your professional development, or has it?
I'm not sure it has. But I'm not sure it has because I think that my professional development was just, for me, it happened to be as much of a random walk as anything, with a lot of a couple lucky breaks and a couple crappy breaks. But going back to some of the questions you saw earlier, what I saw from my parents were people that actually there wasn't really, they didn't take, they were always working. I don't mean overworking, right? But that's just because it's one of the things, you work and you have a family, but you're always, you're not at a point in time where you're ever not working, because how could you be, right? How do you make a living if you're not working? And so to me, that was like, okay, well, that was like the archetype that I saw. So I've always just worked, and I made some dumb ass decisions, totally, and then a couple serendipitous ones, but they weren't really guided by anything like that, and they weren't guided by. I think it was just like, I gotta, you have to, I want to be satisfied professionally, but also have to earn an income.
So you bring up this concept of luck, which I think is so often overlooked in the context of an entrepreneurial life and the success of a company, and also maybe the success of a venture capitalist, right? And so you're shaking your head, yes, a lot. So you know where I'm going, but
all the way.
How do you account for luck when you're thinking about whether or not you're going to make an investment, or do you?
Yeah. So I think way too much about luck. And I think that you have a lot of it, you've been investing a lot of your career too. So you are very aware of the element of where human nature intersects with investing and investing decisions as well. And so I believe that part of human nature, i.e. the ego, is such that it's hard for us to satisfy satisfy the ego by attributing too many things to luck, because then it appears random and not that anything we controlled, right? And it's not due to our skills, our wonderful qualities, but they were random, right? And so it's very hard to attribute things to luck, which means I believe that oftentimes we don't attribute things to luck that happen to be full of luck. Now, at the same time, I do believe that it takes a lot of skill to be lucky.
I agree.
What luck probably means, and I do tie this back to venture capital because I think venture capital happens to be an investment class and a process of investment decisions that really is centered around this, which is ensuring that you have enough opportunities to invest that you may get lucky on some of them. And so that's where that luck part comes in, meaning the decisions you make, right? There are like 4 or 5 unbelievable points of randomness that could lead to those investment decisions being good decisions or bad decisions. And when you look in hindsight, like a couple of them, when you look at the successes in hindsight, the successful investment decisions, there are kind of random moments that could have gone either way. We have a company right now. I'm not going to say what it is, but it's had just a wonderful 18 months, and it's really incredible. And I think this company could go public in the next 2 years, and it'd be a really great accomplishment for the CEO. And the last 18 months, they've just had enormous periods of growth. They're just hitting their stride with the wonderful product that people are paying for. And the company's been around for about 5 years, and there was a decision early on that in hindsight was a brilliant decision. Brilliant decision. And I kind of remember the process we went through, which is like 3 of us sitting in a room, like, I guess, let's try it and see what happens, it wasn't right. And so, but in hindsight, we can construct a real systematic, thought that went into it. And sure, some of that, but also it was like, right time, right place. People were in a good mood that day, and so, but you have to be, and so as an investor in the venture side of things, you have to have enough of those, to do it. And then
You have to have a portfolio.
Yeah, this is why portfolio construction is so important. Now, the interesting thing is entrepreneurs don't really have a portfolio. They do
not.
One. They have one.
Yeah.
But it does mean that luck comes into play in what they do too. And I think the way that comes into play is them being open to them understanding the first principles by which they're doing something. We want to help musicians, or we want to help artists, or we want to help provide more access to healthcare, and then be open to a lot of the randomness that comes into play and hope you kind of get that right. But again, if you're open to enough of it, the odds are one of them could be right, and then it works out, and so that's luck.
You hope.
And sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes even with that, it doesn't. So,
it's interesting because you brought up the idea of hindsight, this 2020, and so often, especially in the world of sports, and people talk about the Monday morning quarterback, right? And they always talk about how the team that won did X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
And, any 1 or 2 plays could have totally changed the outcome of the game.
Totally.
And the Monday morning quarterback would be saying something entirely different.
This is the problem.
Right?
The problem with hindsight is that it gives us perfect clarity in situations of which there was no clarity whatsoever when you looked at them. Right?
Exactly. And I'm not going to bring it up for a similar reason, but I recently went through an interesting marketing sprint.
Yep.
And obviously this is hindsight construction, I'll call it, right? How Peloton did everything right,
mm-hmm.
and how Mirror was a failure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
And we all know what Mirror just sold for.
Yeah.
I think very few people will consider that to be a failure at the end of the day.
No.
Right.
The creation of $500 million of value. Yeah.
And what's funny is that the story as to why it sold for $500 million is about to change.
Yep. Totally.
Right.
Totally.
So the entire analysis is now different.
Absolutely. So I like this is one of my favorite topics. I like the word serendipity better than luck. Though I
like that word.
Though I believe they mean very similar, if not the same things. And I like that because,
sure,
when we say luck, you think it's randomness is what we think, right? So you can't control it. And serendipity implies something that maybe you might have a little more control over, which I think is accurate. What we don't have control over is the outcome, but we have control over is your ability to have enough serendipitous events happen. And maybe one of those ends up being the right one. And that's why, that's the idea of it takes a lot of skill to be lucky. It takes a lot of skill to allow yourself to be in the right place, that when one of those serendipitous accounts events happened, you may be able to take advantage of it. And I imagine when you look at back at the history of successful companies, a lot of that success may happen probably is attributable to those serendipitous accounts. And serendipity does not mean there's a lack of intelligence that goes into it. I think the opposite, right? But you have to be open that when that event when you see that event, you take advantage of it, And in hindsight, they look brilliant. When they fail in hindsight, they look like it was a stupid decision, right? But
of course,
could go either way, right?
So I cannot agree with you more. And I'm going to add just a couple things to that sort of moment, that serendipitous moment. It's a combination for me, I think, of skill, yes, but also resiliency and persistence.
Totally.
Because that moment may not be available at some earlier point in time.
Absolutely.
But you got to be able to witness it, at a later date. And there's something I like to say, which is, my dad, I talk to my dad every week, and I love my dad. And he's like, how's business? How are things going? I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing that I've always said to him about when I'm starting a company is that, and he says, well, what's it going to do? How's it going to go? How's it going to grow? How are you going to get customers? And I say, look, I don't know. But here's what I do know. I got to be on the field in order to make plays.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you can draw up a play, but as soon as you hike the ball or the whistle blows or the jump, whatever it is, then people start to move.
Yeah.
And you got to be able to adopt.
Exactly. And all the work that went into that moment is what prepares you to react to that moment, even though those reactions may be the things that you couldn't have anticipated, and
Totally.
and being open to that. So that's why I like, and I sometimes think that like maybe by some chance I stumbled into venture capital because I do think at a certain level it is a serendipity business, which again, fine line between serendipity and luck, but there's much more of that than I know this is what's going to I know this is what the world is going to look like. So therefore I'm going to make that decision on that. It's never that certain. You're making, especially at the early stages, you were making uncertain investment decisions into unproven teams with untested technology in unknown markets.
That's incredible. So, and I can tell that people are going to hit the rewind 10 seconds or 30 seconds button or whatever it is. Can I ask you to say that again?
Now you're gonna, if you assume I remembered it, So you're making uncertain investment decisions into untested founders in unknown markets with technology that you don't know if it could even work.
I love that. I'm going to rewind it myself and listen a couple of times.
Yeah, you should rewind. It did sound pretty good when I said it, but it is. But those are there are 4 layers of unknowns, and we know compounding, right? Means when you multiply all those things together, you get a big unknown. And so it's at some level when you do that math, it's like you shouldn't. This is not a decision that you should make, right? And then you have the two sides of that market, which you've played on, which have very different motivations, right? As an investor, it's like, okay, I'm going to make 20 of those. I would never make one of them.
Right.
Because that's not a diversified portfolio. Or I couldn't attract dollars to make one of those, but I can attract dollars to make 20 of those, And now I've got diversification, and that's the motivation on the investor side. And the entrepreneur side, as you know, the motivation is something very, very different. Sometimes it's something very personal. And probably most of the time it's something very personal.
So let me tie those two things, because one of the things that we talk about a lot at Alto IRA is portfolio diversification, and how kind of for the first time in history, individual investors can build a diversified portfolio at any monetary scale, which they couldn't do before, right? The world is changing. But for the entrepreneur, we only get one shot, right? There's only one bite at the apple. And so I'm actually thinking right now about the clothes that I'm wearing.
Yep.
I'm like, I got a Life is Good hat on, and also a t-shirt, by the way. I'm wearing Lululemon shorts and darn tough Vermont socks.
Okay.
These are all mission-driven businesses.
Yeah.
And Alto is a mission-driven business,
Totally.
right? We want to make alternatives available to individuals. We want to make it easy to invest. We want to make it affordable. USB is famously a thesis-driven venture capital shop. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of the theses that drive the investment philosophy, and also what role does mission play in the thesis?
So I think so. I believe thesis at some level, to me at least, is an analogy for process as well. And so is the thesis of the firm is wrapped up into a process by which decisions are made. But the thesis, at some level, has not changed in 15 or 16 years since my partners Fred and Brad started it. And the thesis, at its core, was a recognition that what is it about the internet? And then you have to kind of pull apart that definition. What is the internet? It's a series of interconnected computers, and by creating a series of interconnected computers that is basically fault tolerant, right? It was built to withstand a nuclear attack. You have connected computer to computer, but person to person or person to computer, and that was a fundamental architectural shift, and not only technology wise, but metaphorically what that represented to the world. And the thesis was that can engender businesses that are native to this technology shift, things that couldn't have existed before. There was no analogy for these things to exist. And so that I would say at its core has never changed. And that's the core. And then we've articulated what that means because that's very abstract. And we've articulated every 4 or 5 years, which is typically a reflection of how we are thinking about why that matters for that 4 or 5 year period. And so I would say the initial 4 or 5 year period, and I'm roughly estimating those time periods, it was when you have this thing called the internet, this interconnected series, you could actually create these large networks around the world. And so the firm invested in large networks, and those large networks could be Twitter or Tumblr, things like that. And those are the successes, right? So for every one of those, there's 5 that didn't work, but those are the successes. But those are large networks. And then you're 5 or 6 years into that era, and you start looking at the networks, and you're saying, well, it's not just about large networks; it's about these things called market-specific networks, right? Which are narrower, but they're narrower within a certain domain or a certain problem set. So financial services, or healthcare, or education, or anything else. And so then we kind of shifted our attention to these large networks, but they were market-specific. They were narrow. And wrapped up in that is and are cryptocurrencies, which are networks too, but they're decentralized networks. So we articulated it that way, and then in the last 3 or 4 years, we've articulated to even a finer point, which actually I think answers the question you asked me, which is, well, what's important about all these networks? And one of the important things is that they expand access, they broaden access. And so maybe the thesis articulation is things that broaden access in certain areas, like well-being, like learning, and financial independence are those 3 areas. And not only ones that broaden access, but that this network could engender new types of trust between people or between services. And so our latest articulation is our trusted brands that broaden access to these things. And those words are all very abstract at some level because they're very dynamic, they're not static. And so the notion of that is that trust, new forms of trust could be the equivalent of mission orientation as you describe it. I might say that for all those those things you're wearing, or the stuff you buy from because you believe that mission aligns with you, is you have a certain level of trust with their principles and their statements and the way they act. And if they violate that trust, then that relationship with you will be violated. And to us, that's kind of mission. And trust can mean different things. Trust doesn't only have to mean that I trust you with my money, though that's one form of trust, right? Trust can mean I trust that you are going to kind of do this for me in a better, faster, cheaper way, which means a business that is going to continually raise prices would break that trust and might not fit that. So that's how we think about it, is we take the kind of concept of mission and pull it apart into the idea of trust and broadening access to something of which there might be limited access to.
I really like that, and I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people who are listening to the show. I think the other thing that we can expect is that people who are listening to this are sort of asking themselves, okay, so I see a mission-driven business that I'm attracted to. How do I know if it's a good investment? What are the characteristics? And some people will say, and the world is full of cliches. Some people say bet on the horse. Some people say bet on the jockey. Um, are there certain pillars or metrics or characteristics that you are thinking about as to a level of attraction or conviction for a particular type of investment?
I think every investor or every firm does it their own way. And that there isn't a right way or a wrong way. There's just every firm does it their own way. So there are firms that are like jockey. It's the person, nothing else but the person, literally 100%. And incredibly successful firms at that. I believe this includes my partners, have found that at some level it's very hard to evaluate a human being. You are at some level.
Very.
You are at some level. You are. It's hard to know what are those right characteristics. I'm giving to a bunch of students a VC primer next week, some interns, and part of my core of this primer is this notion that in a way every successful company, or in particular every successful startup, is an exception to a rule. And at some level, at this type of investing, and maybe all types of investing, it's your job is to pattern match exceptions, right? And so,
Right.
So for every one you come up with, then you're looking for the exception to that, which means there is no real rule, right? There are definitely patterns, and then you make a value judgment as a group of people of what are those patterns that matter to you, which don't always 100% have to correlate with the best returns, right? So we've just because our firm is small, and a word we like to use is collegial, which probably most firms do, but we're in one office. We have funds that are $200 million. We have a very collaborative process that it's very important for us to work with people we like. And that we think we will like over 5 or 10-year periods. I'm very careful saying that because I 100% do not believe that there is always a correlation between that and good investment returns. Right? So
Right.
we've made that decision at a personal level that's just because we like, and I can list to you a number of companies where we would have returned many hundreds of millions of dollars, or if not billions of dollars, because the people did not meet that criteria. And 100% there's regret. There always is questioning, like, are we sure that's our principle? But that's a principle we had, right? So that's the part of as we evaluate the person, and not only their business, it's like, do we like them? It's almost like we're too small, that if we have a bad relationship with someone, it can affect everything because of the size and the structure of us. And so sometimes it's that, like there's a company that we invested in that was his founder's second company, and I backed his first company, and it was total startup. There was nothing else there when he did it. So that was completely a person question. But inside the person question, I think there's also kind of a motivation question, right? And this person, I think what we found attractive was this notion that he had a successful sale of his first company, but it was early in the life of the company. And so the thing that he did not prove was that he actually could build and run a company. He proved he could build a product that worked really
Right.
well and sell it to someone else to do that to. We thought in that case that was a big motivating factor for someone that at a young age had some success but had not proved that he could be a CEO. And so that's
There's a big difference between the two.
big difference. And so that was kind of like part of that investment thesis. There was obviously someone we liked. It's obviously someone we trust, but that's an interesting motivation for him to try something new when he otherwise didn't have to. So that's kind of like, there's a jockey bet, but it's a little more, you gotta peel it apart, a little more. Right. And then I think this is a problem, but I think this is actually, I'm really glad you asked this, because I do think this is, I think this is a structural deficiency in venture capital. up till this point. And it's a structural deficiency because if you think about this conversation we've had, that will lead us in most instances, if not every instance, in investing in patterns that we know or people that we know. Which means there are people we don't know or patterns that we don't know that we do not invest in, which I think means that overall we're kind of investing in each other, same people, same backgrounds. And there's probably a whole class of people that are not getting access to investment dollars who are entrepreneurs.
So I'm so glad you said that for two reasons. One, because I've just started to read How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yep.
Which I cannot recommend enough, even just based on the short amount I've read to date. But also because one of the questions I was going to ask you about, and you and I have had some of this conversation in the past, which is investment access. So only really wealthy people have access to invest with firms like yours.
Absolutely.
And so part of my question is, do you have thoughts on what it means to define accredited investor or limit who has the ability to invest with a professional investor or investment firm like USV?
Well, yes, it's a couplefold. One is that every time we have a fund cycle, this notion hits us really clearly, that it's a very limited number of people that have access to our funds, and that those limitations are structural and pretty significantly structural. There are laws, right? There are
regulatory
restrictions, right? And there are regulatory restrictions. Even things like, if I was raising a fund right now, I actually couldn't tell you I'm raising a fund. I'm not really allowed to solicit, right? Anti-solicitation on top of accredited stuff, right? So, and I think that if you think about like the regime for those laws that started in the 34, 35, or 33 and 4 Securities Act were informational ones, right? And so
Correct.
And the fundamental there was that there's no information for you to make a decision. So these are laws that will force that information, right? Clearly the world is different, which is not to suggest that the full information is there. We can debate that, but it's a debate. And it used to not be a debate. There was no information.
I could not agree more because, we're talking about the securities laws in 1933 and 34.
Yeah.
And clearly, back to your own thesis of what the internet has done for the world, I don't think anyone could argue that. Now, we could debate the truth of the information available, but the fact is information is available.
Well, I could, and you could, excuse me, you or I could publish our investment results, and we could have them audited, and we could have them verified and put them up on a website. Now, then that's a really interesting conversation of, is that enough for someone? But we can do it, and we can verify it. Absolutely. In fact, we have there are some public pension funds that have invested in USV. So our results are actually published by them because they're required to publish it, right? And so it's like, it's the best of intentions. Like I think about we invest a lot of healthcare. The HIPAA law, which is a regulation that has
Crazy.
the best of intentions. Your health information, the privacy of it there is the primacy around the privacy of your health information and the sanctity of it and the security of it. That's HIPAA, right? The letter of that regulation, though, because of that, means that a doctor is violating the law by emailing you on Gmail. 100%. A doctor is violating HIPAA by texting you. So best of intentions, constricting the industry, right? We happen to be seeing right now that that's being blown up because the medical profession has decided that it cannot actually service people except doing it. So people are just doing it.
Right. So what I think is actually quite interesting, and I should probably roll that word back because it's probably not interesting, but what the pandemic has forced upon all of us is the requirement to embrace new practices, legal or otherwise, right?
Yeah.
So when you talk about HIPAA, right? I can visit my doctor via telemedicine or not,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Better that I do it. And to your point, so often with regulatory regimes, we have unintended consequences.
Exactly.
And so how do you address the unintended consequences? And I think, for so long, physicians' practices and others were fighting with the health insurance companies as to whether or not they could have a code for reimbursement for a telemedicine visit.
Absolutely. Right. A visit
Well,
like
now
this.
they have to.
Now they have to. Exactly.
Right. And, so unintended consequence of a pandemic, but a positive one, I think, there.
I'm kind of really interested. I bet you are, because you're closer to this too, like the whole, Robin Hood phenomena of lowering dramatically the entry point to invest, meaning like fractional shares and no fee trading, like you take all those barriers away. And I'm not well versed in it enough to have to pass judgment on it, though I've seen the data in the increases in retail investing versus programmatic investing, and that feels kind of interesting, right?
I think it's completely interesting. And, this is a much longer conversation than the time that we have left for this particular show, but it would be an interesting one because, so many people say we're just trying to protect Americans from themselves, and therefore they should not have access to invest with a professional private equity firm or be able to invest in alternatives. But somehow it's okay to allow them to invest in Hertz when they've declared bankruptcy.
Absolutely.
Right. And they're going to do it. So
yeah.
Big problem.
Yeah. And so it could be one of those things that could be where the change comes because it comes from the bottoms up. Like you can't ignore it. There's a demand for it, however you describe that demand, whether it's meme investing, treating it like a game or whatever, there's something there.
So look, I could talk to you forever, and yes, we will. But I do want to be respectful of your time. But there are just two more questions that I want to ask before I let you go. One is, you have been both an operator and on the opposite side of the table as the investor. Do you prefer one versus the other?
There are times when, as an investor, a challenge is that you don't actually make the decisions. You counsel and advise, and then you step back. And try and be an ancestor, not a ghost. But the decisions are what they are, and that can be kind of frustrating. But on the other hand, you get the benefit of participating in 85 or 90 companies and learning from that large set of patterns. So I don't really know. I've thought about it before, and I don't have a good answer. I don't really have a good answer because sometimes it changes by the day, but it doesn't really matter because I'm an investor. So
right, yeah, you are an investor. So I really want to know why you're not a music writer by trade.
Well, we all have our dreams that we still have time to fulfill, don't we?
We do.
Yeah.
I love that answer.
Yeah, it's the truth.
I absolutely love that answer. So my last question, I asked you before you came on the show, window or aisle? and you said aisle.
Totally. No question.
Why?
So I cannot explain how airplanes fly. Doesn't make sense to me. I've read Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. Just doesn't make sense to me how a jet plane flies. It really doesn't. And it doesn't make sense to me while sitting on it, and it doesn't make sense to me while in the air, and it doesn't make sense to me on landing. Like, I don't understand how such a large structure full of hundreds of people can get from point A to point B. It doesn't make sense. So I need to feel like I have a way to get off that plane, if need be, if the unknown part of that knowledge starts to really kind of freak me out. So that's the macro. Now I'll give you the micro level. I cannot sleep on planes. It's just impossible. And I've tried everything. It doesn't matter. I can't sleep.
Yeah.
Well, I can fly overnight. I can fly during the day. I just don't sleep. So I'm that person that's getting up a lot and kind of pacing and just moving around and exercising because I know I'm not sleeping. And if I was on the window and the person on the aisle was sleeping, I would be intensely annoying to them. I'd be really annoying to them.
I completely agree.
What about you? Are you window or aisle?
I'm an aisle because it gives me this false sense of control.
Yeah, totally right, exactly.
It's entirely why.
I have a friend who I admire intensely, and she's a window person because she will sit down and fall asleep, and will not wake up till that plane lands. And so the idea of an aisle to her is terrifying.
Right. Yeah. Oh my God, I'm going to have to get up and let somebody go to the bathroom or pace the plane.
Exactly. So I'll give you a related airplane question. I can't fly in a plane with propellers, not because they're not safe, but because a propeller suggests to me how the plane works. And it's magic to me. I don't want to know how it works. Like you see a propeller, I'm like, okay, I get that, right? I don't want to know. I don't want to know how that thing works. A jet, like look at the end. Go on a jet and look at the jet engine. How does that get the plane in the air? No idea.
Are you a nervous flyer?
No, not. I used to be, not anymore, because like you, part of our occupation involves flying continuously. So I got over it.
Yeah, you just got to go.
I'm not nervous. And I don't sit on the plane and I'm nervous, or I'm not waiting for it to take. I'm nervous. In fact, I'm incredibly calm. It's just that there's like that knowledge of I don't know how this works, so therefore it's magic. So that's okay. It's magic, but I don't want to know. Like I can't look into the cockpit ever. Right, like as you're walking and going to the back of the plane, I can't look into the cockpit because I'm like, no, that buttons take away the magic. Those are operation ones, I'm good with this being magic, right?
Better to not know, just believe.
Just believe, right? Propellers are knowledge. Don't want any of that.
Andy, I cannot thank you enough for being on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
As always, it was an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to the next time that we're actually in the same room.
In Nashville.
In Nashville, maybe Lipstick Lounge.
Totally. But it'll be in Nashville. It'll be one of the great cities in America.
Thank you for saying so. Everybody in Nashville thanks you for saying so.
A message from our sponsor, Alto IRA. Retirement in America is broken, and Alto revolutionizes retirement investing by providing access to investment opportunities beyond the public markets. It's online, automated, and simple. Plus, it's cost-effective. You don't have to be rich to invest in alternatives. Get started today at altoira.com.